Rodrigo,
Yes.
thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Ordinary Time. How are you?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me in my home parish. It's a nice parish, so
Thanks for
glad you're able to
having
make it.
us.
Yeah.
Shout out to Father Raphael,
Yes.
too, for having us here, his parish, for you and your family for coming out here and inviting
Of
us.
course.
This is my first time here.
How do you like it?
I love the parish.
Yeah.
I was actually driving in. I know you guys are in the middle of
Yeah.
a capital campaign to build the new parish. And
Mhm.
uh, me and Thomas, as we were driving in here today, I was thinking, why do they need a new parish? This looks beautiful.
Well, when you have 4,500 families here and about almost 10,000 individuals, you need a little bit of a bigger parish.
Wow,
Yeah.
what a growth
I know.
you
Yeah.
guys have experienced.
Yeah.
Isn't so we're in Nocatee, St. Johns County. This is one of the fastest growing areas in the state of
It is.
Florida. Is that right?
hmm
Wow.
Every single Easter, we have more people getting baptized than the year before, and it's the same story the year before. So
You
it's been
guys are
really
growing.
nice to see. Yeah.
All praise and glory be to
Course.
God.
But
That's
yeah. But
amazing.
I think most importantly, we're growing, but we're also a big family. And so I think it may be a small space, but we're all one loving family. So
I
it's
love
good to be
that.
here. Yeah.
Well, thanks for having us. I'm really excited to get to know you, and I'm more excited for
Mm,
those that are tuning in today to hear your story. So
yeah.
you're a #1 best-selling bilingual author. You wrote your first book before you entered your freshman year of high school.
The first draft was written August 6th, 2023, and my first day of school was like August 10th. So it's kind of surreal.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
there's like many adults watching this that are still trying to write their first book.
That's-
And you're not even, so you're a rising senior
mm,
this year, is that right?
yeah.
And so when did the book officially get published?
So the book got published, I believe it was October 6th, 2025. I was really hoping to get it October 7th,
Sure.
but October 6th was the day it ended up getting published. And it's been great. I mean, my mom put a lot of money on the book to make it happen. So if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have probably published it. And then you were talking about adults who don't finish their book, but Jennifer Farmer was a woman that helped me. She wrote her first book about 4 years before I published mine. And so I think most importantly, yeah, writing the book is an accomplishment, but a lot of people don't realize that it's not just the author that puts pen on a paper to write the book, but it's also the entire support team behind. And so one of the things that I've always been really passionate about is making sure that all the people that made sure that my book was able to hit the shelves get recognized, because a lot of authors leave them out. But no, we're going to put it
Wow.
front and center. We got to put it
Un
front and center. Yeah.
Unbelievably humble of you. I think that's so cool. Matter of fact, I read a good book and there was a chapter in this book. It was called The Turtle on the Fence Post.
Mm,
And so if you just imagine for a second a turtle sitting on a fence post, if you walked by there, you would obviously recognize that turtle didn't get there on its own.
no.
And so the entire point of this chapter was about recognizing those that really kind of put you on that fence post. How did they get you there?
Yeah,
So I love that you're doing
for
that.
sure. Yeah.
I remember likewise when I published my first book,
Which
how
is also a big deal, by the way. Yeah.
ah
It's also a big deal.
this isn't a plug, I promise. But I remember how hard it was to like sit down and write that. And you hear about writer's block,
Mhm.
but yeah, that's truly it's a real condition
Oh,
for
yeah.
people who are trying to write. It's just like just keep writing.
Yeah.
Just write.
I don't know if it was the case for you, but for me, writing the first draft wasn't the issue. It was going back and re-editing it, which took a while. I think it
Yeah,
might have been published a year before then, but the Holy Spirit sometimes has to stop you in your tracks before
absolutely.
to finish it. So I think
Absolutely.
the end product's better because of it.
So we're gonna get into the details of your book, which is called
Yeah,
Fortitude.
that's
You've
right.
written it's an English and Spanish copy.
Yes.
Obviously, it was written in a pretty significant period of time
hmm
where your generation of peers,
hmm
kind of the news cycles will kind of affirm this,
Oh
that
yeah.
we're seeing a lot more anxiety, we're
hmm
seeing a lot more depression, we're seeing a lot more just our youth facing challenges
mm
that many of their parents or grandparents maybe can't relate to. So I want to get into that, but before we get into that, I want to
Yeah.
hear a little bit about you,
Right.
your story. So Rodrigo, you were born in Mexico,
Yes.
you moved to the United States,
hmm
you were also born with a sensory processing
Yeah.
disorder. So I want to hear about your like upbringing in your life before you got to this place, because you're not that old now and you've
No.
already accomplished so much.
No.
So take us back and let's get to know you a little bit, Rodrigo. Tell
Yeah.
me a little bit about your story.
Of course. So I was born August 1st, 2008, and I was born in Monterrey, Mexico. So I think it's pretty important for the story because obviously it's ordinary time, and obviously Mexico is a very Catholic place. But I think it's pretty important because obviously being Catholic is such an important part of my identity. So being born in Mexico obviously facilitated that identity. But more important, the city where I was born, Monterrey, Mexico, is almost 95% Catholic. So obviously that had a huge impact on me. But I think one other important part of my personality is not just where I was born, but what happened when I was there. So when I was 2 years old, my primary school teacher started noticing that I was a little bit different. They noticed that all of the kids were okay if they spilled something on their shirt, but if I spilled something on my shirt, it was Armageddon. It was the end times. Bring Jesus down because it was the second coming. I could not listen to loud music. I couldn't even go to a movie theater. I remember my mom took me to watch a movie once when I was like 2 or 3, and I screamed in agony because I couldn't do it with all the sounds. And so one of the primary school teachers came up to my mom and they said, I really think that your kid should get tested for autism. Now, it's a bit more casual to talk about it these days, but especially back then, I wouldn't say there was so much as a stigma as there was a lack of understanding as to what it actually was. And so my mom was like, okay, we'll go get him tested. And so I went through a series of tests, and it was like an aptitude test. There was 10 things that every 2-year old or 3-year old should be able to do. You know how many things I was able to do? Two.
Wow.
I was only able to do 2 things. And so afterwards they went back to my mom and they're like, we don't think it's autism, we don't think it's Asperger's, but it's this thing called the sensory processing disorder, which at first can sound very fancy and complicated to understand, but really it just means that all of your senses are sort of distorted. So you hear things more loudly than other people. You have a lot of problems with getting close to people. So like, as anyone that knows me will know, I sometimes have a tough time getting too close to people. Sometimes I have to be told to step back a bit, but that's not something that I picked up recently. It's something that I've had since I was 2 years old or even before then. And especially the textures is very difficult. So not a single one of my friends or family members can remember seeing me in jeans because I don't like wearing jeans. I don't like the texture. I will wear anything but jeans. And so that's something that started back then. But I think one of the most important parts about having the sensory processing disorder was the support that I have, because I think every single one of us can think back to a time when we were told that we had some sort of issue or some sort of problem. And the most difficult thing isn't finding a solution, because there's a solution to every single problem, but it's having that support system behind you. And one of the things that I have come to appreciate over time, but I was way too young to realize it at that time, was my family was super accepting of the fact that I needed help. I think some parents might have told the doctor that told them that I had a sensory processing disorder, they might have said something like, well, we don't really know if our kid is like that, or no, my kid can never have that. But the only question my mom asked is, what exactly can we do?
Mm.
And they told her that I needed to go to therapy for 5 days a week. And it was all kinds of therapy. It was physical therapy, it was psychological therapy, it was sound therapy, it was all sorts of things. And I think one of the beauties of the way that my mom handled it is I didn't really know that I was different from all kinds of people. Like, I used to think that everybody went to therapy 5 days a week. I thought everybody had to do listening therapy. I thought that everybody didn't like jeans. I thought that nobody could handle loud sounds. But because it was such a regular part of my routine, I think that I found a lot of things about myself during that time that really helped me become a better person. I think one of the most significant things is a lot of that listening therapy included a lot of classical pieces by Mozart.
Mm.
And so if I started listening to that when I was about 2.5 years old, and then about 6 months later, I started playing the violin. I used to really enjoy playing with my toys when I would do the listening therapy, but my dad would always put soccer games on, so I started watching soccer with my dad. And I obviously formed a close bond with my mom during that time period and my sister, who was great. So I think while it could have been a very limiting time, I think the way that my family handled it made it so that not only did I not think I was different, but I was also able to find a lot of things about myself.
I was debating on whether I would want to go here or not. It's just the Holy Spirit is so sweet
Yeah.
how he works and how he brings us together in different times of life. And the fact that you and I are sitting down having
Mhm.
this conversation at this time of
Oh,
life
yeah.
is not a coincidence. Um, Matter of fact, my wife and I, we've got 6 children, a
Mm.
seventh child on the way, and I think one of the hardest.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank
That's
you
a,
so much. Most people are like, you know how that works, right?
no.
Very negative, and it's like,
Yeah.
who are you? So shout out to anybody who has a big family.
Yeah.
You're loved and supported.
Yeah.
But I'll say this as a parent,
Mhm.
it's so hard
Mhm.
to see your child struggle with something
Mhm.
physical, emotional, mental,
Mhm.
psychological, whatever the category is. It really is. It's so hard because the first reaction is like this pride that comes up that says no. No, he or she is okay. There's
Yeah.
no way they have something wrong. And there's this natural defensiveness that kind of creeps in, and it's pride to
Yeah.
say, one, that something's wrong, something's not normal. So your mother and
Oh, yeah.
father, incredible for making this
For sure.
something that is normal. Um, one of our children in particular has
Mm,
He's an incredible individual,
mm,
one of the most amazing kids you'll meet, and he's going through some things that we've kind of come to in our life, realizing, okay, maybe we need to, maybe this is a time to kind of like
yeah,
figure out if there's something we can do. Is there something we can help to
yeah,
mitigate this? But it's really tough. It's really tough to see somebody you love going through something difficult.
mm,
So I just, that touches me
yeah,
without going into more detail,
yeah,
right? For the sake of my family, it touches me
yeah,
deeply. And so obviously this foundation,
mm,
not just the Catholic part of your foundation, which I want to talk a little bit more about
yeah,
too, but this kind of foundation that you've just described has really set a stage for you
mhm.
to be where you are today. Is that
Yeah,
right?
of course. I think when I was in my less humble part of my life, which I'm sure we'll get into, I always used to think that it was because I read all these books or because I put in all the work. But I think one of the beauties about getting older and certainly more wiser is you're able to realize that it really is your family that sets up everything for you, especially all the lessons that my mom taught me, which I'm sure we're going to get into as well, really set the foundation for everything that came afterwards. And so if I hadn't been diagnosed with a sensory processing disorder, if my parents and my family hadn't been so accepting, and if I hadn't gone through those therapies, I don't know that we'd be talking today. So,
So throw in another scenario.
mhm.
You obviously are born with yeah, I don't even want to call it a disorder
Yeah, it's a
because,
superpower.
right? Yeah, it's a superpower for
Yeah.
sure. You were also one of the youth raised during in school during a pandemic.
Hmm.
This is not something that I have taken a moment to really just reflect on. I mean, I was an adult in the
Yeah.
pandemic, so it affected me in a certain way. I
Yeah.
remember how the pandemic really shaped my day.
Mm,
I have not taken a moment to think about
mm,
what did that look like for people in school, especially with a sensory disorder. You put
mm,
all this work in your life to
mm.
get ready for this moment, and all of a sudden the world's shutting down.
Uh-huh.
You're being forced to leave school.
Mm,
Let's talk about being raised in school during a pandemic.
mm. So I think, first of all, I'm not necessarily someone that is afraid of change. I think one of the beauties about having a sensory processing disorder is that it makes us very adept to being able to adapt to different situations. So even though I've moved about 5 or 6 different times, and within that time period between maybe 2014 and 2020, I moved 4 times in 6 years, including moving from Mexico to the US, I was always able to adapt to my environment. But I think one of the best things that would help me adapt to different environments was that social aspect. From the time that I started talking, I've always found conversations with people. I think you know this. I think you sat down next to me and I immediately started having a conversation. One of the most important things about school, and to this day my favorite part, is being able to be in a classroom with 19 other kids and have conversations, having that peer-to-peer interaction. But on the 13th of March of 2020, was the last time that I was in a classroom until about August 7th, 2021. That was almost 18 months without school. And so you got to think about it. One of the things that I always found comfort in was that I always knew what my day was going to look like. I knew that I would wake up at 6 in the morning, I would ride the school bus at 7:15, and I would get to school at 8 o'clock at Everglades Elementary down in Weston in Broward County. I know that my mom would be the first mom in line at 2:45 o'clock when I got out, and I knew that I would get my homework done from 4 to 6 o'clock. But when the pandemic shut down, all of that was disrupted. I went from being able to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and go to school and be there by 8 o'clock to my school being 6 feet away from me on my computer and my bed being 6 feet away from my computer. I went from being in a classroom of 19 other kids and having friends in other classrooms surrounding me to just being me and my books or me and the violin. And I'm not gonna lie, the first couple months of the pandemic, it was great. A lot of people didn't have jobs. My dad had a great paying job. It was very quiet. I had a little bit more freedom to do what I wanted, and obviously that was great. But when 3 months became four, and four became five, and six became seven, and you start to realize that you really miss that social interaction. And so even though I stopped going to therapy when I was 6 years old, and I was better able to adjust to my surroundings, first of all, psychologically speaking, when you're about 11 or 12 years old, you have other spikes in sensory processing disorder, which I was starting to have. You add into that the fact that the world was shut down, and you add into that I didn't have any peers. I didn't have any friends between maybe April of 2020 until maybe August of 2021. So that was pretty difficult. And then you add into that the fact that we moved one more time from Broward up here to St. Johns County. That was pretty difficult. And so other important factor is, I'm sure that maybe either you know this or you're going to find this out pretty soon. When you're 11 years old, you start thinking that you know better than mom, and you start thinking you know better than dad. And so my mom started passing down the responsibilities of waking up early in the morning, going to bed, eating what you're supposed to. And I was like, yeah, that's nice, but I'm 11 years old. I remember in particular, this was after I started doing debate. She would tell me that you have to sleep like 9 hours a day. And so I pulled up this report from the Mayo Clinic. I was like, oversleeping is something bad. Obviously, the report said you need to sleep 8 hours a day, but I ignored that part. I was like, I don't need to sleep that long. So I started waking up at 10 o'clock in the morning and going to bed at 1 in the morning. And I started having all of these bad habits. And so when you factor all of that together, it was just this tsunami of bad decisions made by an 11-year-old that's cut off from his social circle, an 11-year-old that is confined to his bedroom for almost 18 months. And what you have was a storm brewing, and that's when all the panic attacks started. That's when the despair started. And I think it was a pretty good microcosm of what was happening to my entire generation, but I'm sure we'll get into that in a second.
Well, let's talk about that. So
Yeah.
you're speaking at a very personal level,
Mhm.
and that's amazing to hear
Yeah.
a perspective because for your parents or
Mhm.
and if for us, like we're in survival mode, right?
Yeah.
We're uncertain about what this disease is going to do. We're
Mhm.
we're seeing statistics about how many people are being,
Yeah.
killed. I remember personally looking at the website every day to see what the count was of people being,
Mhm.
that were dying from
You
this.
remember the toilet paper thing too?
Oh,
Like,
the toilet
oh yeah,
paper.
it
Yeah,
was
I
awful.
mean,
Yeah.
come on, like, and if
And the
there's a
masks. Yeah.
right, if the end of the world's happening, you better believe the last thing I'm worried about is toilet paper. I'm sorry.
I don't know why everyone
I
went
don't
for
understand that. Still to this day, I want to figure
it.
that out.
Yeah.
That's one of my life goals. Is like, what's with
What
the
was up with the
toilet paper?
toilet paper? That's what.
For sure. So it's interesting to hear this, but wow, it did. It affected
Hmm.
your generation. So what did you see when you returned, like to back to this environment?
Mm.
What were the effects of this tsunami that you just described?
Well, first of all, visually things were different because no one cared how close you were to one another. I was a boy as well. We were all up rolling around in the grass.
Yeah.
We were giving each other high fives. But I get to my first day at school, not just my first day back, my first day at a new school, my first day of seventh grade, because all of sixth grade I was online. And so the first thing I see is everybody's up in masks. So yeah, I had friends, but it's not like I could go hang out with them. It's not like we can go bike riding or any of that. There was still a barrier to social interaction, so that was pretty difficult. But also, and I feel like a lot of people really don't emphasize this, we haven't been the same ever since the pandemic. Our social interactions certainly were different. I mean, when you have a whole set of kids that spend 18 months doing everything on the screen, you consume a lot of harmful content. You consume a lot of content that you're probably too young to see. And so when you are then in a social setting with other kids, you don't know how to act. Like, put aside the fact that when I was in middle school, I was not very good with social interactions. Neither was anyone else in my friend group. But we also had a pandemic where we were online for 18 months and we didn't have any social interaction. Like, that exacerbated all of that. And I think most of us have been pretty well adjusted afterwards. But I know that there were certainly a couple of my friends that were, and I certainly wasn't either. When I went back, I thought that the panic attacks would stop. I thought that I would be more calm, but I wasn't. And so my mind compartmentalized from being so worried about the pandemic and whether or not I was going to catch a virus or any of that to being worried about school. And I was never a bad student, but I used to never panic about getting a 90 on a math test. Like, a 90 on a math test is good. Last year I probably would have wanted to get more 90s on a math test, but if I would get like a 95 on a math test, that was the end of the world. If I got a 98 on an English test, that was the end of the world. And so instead of being panicked about external things, I started being really panicked about internal things. And that was really weird for me because I was never really a nervous person. Like, being nervous wasn't something that I was used to. I was always one of the calmest people in the room. I was always the positive guy in the room, and I wasn't that anymore. And so that was pretty difficult. And so I started realizing that the last good day wasn't yesterday or the day before. It was the 13th of March of 2020, and we were here in November of 2021, and so obviously that was pretty difficult.
Wow. So you mentioned something that I think is another important topic
Mm.
that's infiltrated this youth, which is
Yeah.
obviously the screen time is not great, right? But the introduction and the influence of harmful content.
Mm.
What are some of the things that you guys struggled with and maybe still struggle with that many people probably aren't aware of. Like how easy is it for this these young
Mm,
kids to be introduced to harmful content, and how
mm,
important is it for those, parents to really be on
mm.
top of this? Like maybe you can speak from the
Yeah,
inside, if
yeah.
you will.
So I think my mom can tell you that I have very bad impulse control. I'm sure that you know that kids have very bad impulse control.
I still have bad
I
impulse
still have
control. Just throwing it out there.
yeah. So you got to think of it. Every single teacher in St. Johns County, you go to Valley Ridge Academy, you go to Patriot Oaks, you go to Nice High School, you go to Ponte Vedra High School, they will all tell you that we get distracted very easily and we're on our phones more than we should be. Think back to how hard it was for us to control our impulses when our classroom was a computer 6 feet away from our bed. And there was no impulse control. Like I still remember I would think to myself, what are the classes that I could watch YouTube while they're teaching the class? And so the band teacher would be doing something, or the history teacher would be teaching about the Trojan horse or the Trojan War, and I would be watching YouTube. And when I thought that the only classes I struggled with were science and math, which is still true to this day, but I have 7 class periods when I was in 6th grade. Yeah, I was spending maybe like 6 hours a day watching YouTube, and that was before the end of school. That was before I would procrastinate on my homework, so that was pretty difficult. But obviously, as I'm sure you know or can imagine, you start watching one thing on YouTube and then that leads you to something else, and then suddenly you're not on YouTube anymore, and that becomes an issue. And I know for many, like for many of my friends, and certainly for myself, yeah, it's still difficult not to go back to those impulses, especially when you weren't around. For many people of my generation, but certainly for me, being with friends was replaced with watching stuff online. And it doesn't matter how many YouTube videos you watch. It doesn't matter how many times Barcelona won, which we didn't win that much, by the way. That was a pretty bad period for my team. Uh, None of that was replaced by being with your friends. And so you start looking for content that evokes a more powerful emotional reaction, which obviously leads you down to some pretty dark paths. And I think that for many people in my generation, even if we have friends today, it's still super easy to go back to that because it's sort of an emotional crutch.
Wow. So you remind me so much of my oldest son
Mm,
in so many ways. But in particular, there's this memory that you made me remember, which is, we have been very intentional to limit screen
mm,
time. Obviously, for one, we ourselves as parents know how bad it is for
mm,
us, and so if we recognize that, we certainly don't want our kids to end up
yeah.
in bad habits. But what's interesting is what technology does for not just the adults, but especially a child who's already living with this imagination
Hmm.
and wants to dream big.
Yeah.
So you probably had these dreams of, you weren't just watching soccer with dad, you weren't
Yeah.
just a big Barcelona fan, but
Mm.
like you probably had this childhood dream of, one
Oh,
day
yeah.
I want to be on the pitch and I
Yeah.
want to play soccer.
Yeah.
So I remember one morning my son woke up, and we had certain days of the week that they have a certain amount of time for screen time, and
Mm,
we had this little Nintendo
yeah.
Switch, and he loved playing FIFA. He's a
Mm,
huge soccer fan.
me too. Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember him coming out of the room one time, and he was like telling me, reliving this game that he won. He was telling me
Yeah.
about it. I thought he was describing a game he just watched.
Yeah.
Like
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
was convinced he was telling me about a game
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
he was either playing in or watched, because
Yeah.
the way he was describing it, he was totally in it.
Mm,
And after we were talking, I was like, dude, it's a video game. But
yeah.
it just dawned on me, no, when he plays that video game and he's playing FIFA, he's physically on the
Exactly. Yeah.
field with his favorite
Yeah.
players. For that moment of time, he really is living in this like
Hmm.
alternative universe.
Hmm.
And that it can be a very addicting
Of course.
thing.
Yeah. Because I know for me, like, I'm a pretty competitive person. And so I was used to going in person and competing for the best seats in the orchestra or competing for the best grades. But when you aren't able to have that competition, yeah, going on FIFA 20 and managing Barcelona to their 7th straight Champions League, that replaces all of that competition. Being able to celebrate a bunch of pixels on a screen may seem very weird to older people, certainly to my parents, but if you aren't able to have your friends, like that's the best social interaction you're gonna get. And so when that's all you have for 18 months, yeah, of course I was gonna come home from school even after in person and do that because
Yeah,
that's what I had. That was my crutch. Yeah.
that's so interesting.
Yeah.
So obviously, all of this leads to a moment
Mm,
where you have this kind of Holy Spirit nudges
Hmm.
you to start thinking about how you're going to address
Yes.
your peers. So
Hmm.
that's an important transition. So at what point did you, one, decide I want to write this book,
Hmm.
Fortitude, and where was that inspiration really born?
So the inspiration was born from absolute hardship because before we get to when I first put the pen on the paper and the ink started drying, we have to talk about why exactly I wrote the book in the first place. I wrote the book in the first place because there was a very deep question that I was wrestling with, which is how can I make today better than yesterday? But even more important is how can I make today the 13th of March of 2020? And the question and the answer I found was I have to make today a good day. I have the power as an individual to align my will with that of God to make today a great day. And I didn't get to that immediately. Like, honestly, I don't think I got to that answer until maybe like a couple of weeks before I published the book because I went through the entirety of seventh grade, which was 2021, 2022. And every single day, and I talk about this in my book, was worse than the last. Like, it wasn't just a storm brewing, it was like an avalanche of snow that was rolling down a hill. And every single day, you would pick up more snow. Like, I think in that particular school year, I think I had like 5 panic attacks in the classroom, like in front of other people. Like, it got to the point where, like, I knew exactly where the counselor's office was. And like once a week, she would come by to whatever class I was in and ask me if I needed to step out. So that's how bad that got. Because it didn't matter that I was back in person. It didn't matter that I had good grades, but I hadn't really found a way to adjust to my life. I hadn't really found a way to make today better than yesterday. And it didn't matter what mom or dad or my sister or my teachers told me, I thought I knew better than them. Because I'm sure that you know this, like a 14-year-old, we think we're invincible. We think that we know better than everyone else when we really don't know better than the person next to us. But that was pretty bad. And so I remember eighth grade summer was all right. And I got into the start of my eighth grade year and it was mostly fine. But when you build your entire life on quicksand, like when the foundation of your life is quicksand, all you need is the shore to come up a little bit, some water to flood it, and everything's absolutely gone. And so I remember there was one particular instance where we were taking a really hard Algebra 1 test, and I didn't think I did that well. And I really wanted to get an A in the class because almost no one had an A in the class, and I was a competitive person, and I wanted to show to everyone that I could get an A in the class. But I was also carrying the weight of the last 2 years behind me because I hadn't really been able to adjust to my environment very well. I wasn't listening to the people around me. I didn't know better than the person next to me. And so I really didn't know how I could get better, but that's what I wanted most of everything. And so when I saw that I got an 87 on the test, not a 67, not a 47, an 87, which most people would have been fine with, I like had a freak out moment. I took the chair in front of me and I started ramming in the desk in front of me. And my math teacher came up to me and she gave me a hug and I broke down crying. And she sent an email home that day. And so I got home and the email was in front of me in the kitchen table and my mom was there. And so before we started talking, I asked to go to the bathroom because I thought that I wasn't going to see the bathroom or I wasn't going to see the room until 2 hours later. I thought we were going to have a marathon session. And she sat me down and, in a motherly way, she was like, this is going to be the quickest conversation we've ever had. I'm like, obviously, you've had these ongoing problems for 2 years. I'm not going to pretend like it hasn't been easy because I was in your shoes once. If I went through a pandemic, if I had a sensory processing disorder, if I was a 14-year-old boy, obviously I would struggle. But at the end of the day, I can't hold your hand through every little thing in your life. I can't go inside of you and will myself to have a better day because myself is not you. I am one person, you're a different one. And so obviously I'm going to love you, but part of that love requires me taking my hands away from you and putting you next to the fire and saying if you can extinguish it. And so she was like, you've always liked reading, so why don't you go read some books about it? And I remember thinking to myself, that's some good advice. I think that I should go read some books. And I remember my uncle had asked me about a couple months before all of this what I wanted for my birthday, and I hadn't given him an answer. And so I was like, you know what? I should go on Amazon and I should find some books. And then I'm going to tell him. And so I look up books. I look up just how to get better books, which obviously brought you to the self-help section. And the first two books I saw was Atomic Habits by James Clear. And 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. So I was like, you know what? These two sound like all right, so I'll purchase them. And so I called them up. The books arrived maybe a couple of weeks later. And I remember I held Atomic Habits in particular in my hand, and I was like, I don't think this is going to make much of a difference, but I'm desperate for something, so I'll start reading it. And so I picked up the book and I started reading it. And I liked page 1, and I liked page 2. And suddenly, a week later, I was halfway through with it, and I started taking notes because I was like, I should remember what I'm reading. And I finished the book. And then I got 12 Rules for Life, and I started reading it, and I started highlighting, and I took notes so I wouldn't forget. And I'm not going to pretend like as soon as I finished reading both of those books, everything was fine. But I started realizing, Jordan Peterson says that my room should be clean, and my room really isn't clean. James Clear says that I should make sure that I wake up on a consistent basis and go to bed at a consistent basis. I should plan my day out. And my circumstances might not be great, but I have the power to change them. And so, come the end of 2022, I realized that I was making a lot of positive changes in my life. And January was the same, and then February was better than January, and suddenly I wasn't having any more panic attacks after February. And then March was a good month, and then April was a good month, and then May was a great month. And suddenly I realized that not only had I been reading more than ever, not only had I been taking more notes than ever, but I was making positive changes every single day. And I remember I went to visit my sister in Salt Lake City, and she asked me, what do you want to do this summer? And it was the summer before my freshman year. And I was like, yeah, I really like to tell anyone that I meet that they can better themselves in my story. And when I got home, I told my sister, before I got home, my sister told me, that's a good idea. You should write a book. And then my mom got home and I told her, and she was like, yeah, I've been telling you to write a book forever. I think you should go ahead and do it. And I believe it was June 12th or June 13th of 2023. I started writing. And then by August 6th, I had a book. And then when I finished writing the book, I remember thinking to myself, not only did I find the answer to the question that I've been wrestling with, but I have a message to people of my generation, which is you have the power as an individual to make your life better. And you can't wait for institutions or you can't wait for someone to give you a rope as you're in the midst of a very deep hole. Like, you have to brace yourself and you have to start climbing by yourself. And I remember in particular, I've been loving movies since forever. There was one scene in particular that I would watch over and over again when I was writing the book, and that was the scene from The Dark Knight Rises when Batman heals his back after it's broken, and the people there start telling him like, no one's gonna give you a rope down, you have to climb by yourself, and so he makes the jump. And so I wanted to tell my generation that we can make the jump, and so yeah, that's how I wrote the book.
Wow, that's really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. So I wanna affirm that 100%,
Yeah.
right? You're
Yeah.
you're totally right, and you're at a young age to
Yeah.
be able to have that kind of epiphany and to
Yeah.
have that experience to go there. Wow, not many people have that experience,
Mhm.
and so for you to have that at such a young age, like the Lord is clearly
Yeah.
using you for something greater, and it already has. Because it's ironic, you're on Amazon searching for books in the self-help section, and now you're the number one
Yeah.
best-selling author in
Yeah.
the self-help section of
Yeah.
Amazon.
Yeah.
At what point, though, did these habits that you were producing to
Mm.
become better start to integrate into your faith? Because
Mm.
how much does the Catholic faith speak into that as well?
Mm. So that's really funny that you say that. When I was writing the first draft of my book, indeed, when I finished the first draft, yeah, I was Catholic. I grew up in one of the most Catholic cities in North America, but I wasn't really living my faith. So the biggest influence that I had when I bettered myself, it wasn't Roman Catholicism, it was the Stoic philosophy. And obviously, Stoicism is a great philosophy. It's very popular today. But the problem with Stoicism is that, ironically, even though it preaches humbleness, it makes you a very arrogant person. Because if I could summarize the whole Stoic philosophy in one line, it's that through the virtue of your reason, you will be able to better your life. And so, where Catholicism would say something like, it's important to listen to your feelings, not to follow them, but because they point you in a good direction, Stoicism says your feelings shouldn't control you. You should rationalize them. You should put them aside. And so that's the way that I handle things. And so the first version of Fortitude, which wasn't even called Fortitude, because if it wasn't for me rediscovering my faith, I wouldn't have even titled it that. The book wasn't Catholic. It was certainly very stoic. And the thing about it is, Stoicism's great, but it's not God. And so, even though I had a bunch of good habits, even though I was waking up at a consistent basis, even though I was planning my day every day, even though I was practicing that violin for an hour a day, I was a very egotistical guy. And in particular, I would have conversations with my mom where she would be congratulating me for bettering myself. And I was like, yeah, but I did that myself. I'm like Seneca. I'm like Marcus Aurelius. I figured this out myself. And she was like, but you really didn't. Like, I took you to therapy when you were 2, when you couldn't even talk or walk normally. And I was like, yeah, but that was 12 years ago. Like, I'm talking about today. I read those books. And so, certainly, the very first version of that book was very arrogant. And that isn't to discredit all the effort that I put in, but I certainly wasn't an expert in anything, but I really thought I was. I really thought I was the big deal. And the problem with thinking that you're the big deal is that you're not. He's the big deal. That's the big deal over there. And so, quickly, what could have been a period of my life that was great was then built on a quicksand again. Because the thing with thinking that you know everything is that God's going to remind you at every available opportunity, of which there are several because we're human, that you don't know everything and that you don't have the answer to every problem. He has the answer to every problem, and you got to look to Him to get the answers. And I would say that after I finished the first draft of my book, I don't think I edited again until about a year and a half later because my life started to spiral again. So I think there's a couple of different sections that are important. First of all, I've been doing debate since I was in 5th grade, and I've always been really, really good at debate. And my goal was always to be the best debater possible. And when you're striving for something, when you're trying to achieve something, obviously there's no room to be egotistical because you're striving for it. The problem with it eventually, especially if you're just a stoic, especially if you're not paying attention to mass, especially if you think that you know better than everything, which I did, by the way. Like, I would always filter out whatever Father Pagano or whatever Father Levia said through that lens. The problem is that eventually, sooner or later, if you're really disciplined, which I was at the time, you're going to hit your goal and they're not going to know what happens. So I remember in particular, November 18th, 2023, I had a debate tournament. I did really good in it. And somebody recorded a video of my final round. And they asked me if they could put it on Twitter. And they did. And the next day I had like 10,000 views. And I was like, oh, that's whatever. That's cool. But at like around 9 or 10, Vivek, who was running for president, found my video, retweeted it, and then it had like 7 million impressions. And so I reached that summit, and like for a period of like 24 hours, I was the best debater. I was the most famous debater in the country for like 24 hours, because then, the next day everyone forgets. But what could have been a really good moment was ruined because it got to my head. And suddenly I thought, well, do I really need to do my homework every day? Because I did this. Do I really need to listen to the people around me? Because I fixed my life, basically, and I got what I wanted. And I remember in particular, it's a conversation that I didn't remember until maybe a couple of months ago. But looking back on it, I would say it's even more significant than the conversation we had before. And it was one with my mom. And she was like, I'm starting to see that you're not the same person. You're not as nice as you used to be. You're certainly not as humble as you used to be. You're going to remember this conversation not now, but eventually when you fall back down again, however however further down you have to fall, you're going to remember this conversation and you're going to look to Jesus. And I was like, that's whatever, it's not going to happen. It happened. My grades started falling. All the good habits I built up, the waking up early, the planning every day, it all fell down. And no matter what I tried to do, no matter how many times I read Seneca, no matter how many times I read meditations, no matter how many Ryan Holiday podcasts I would listen to, I couldn't find my way back up. And when I got to sophomore year, my grades were like absolutely disastrous. I didn't have any friends because I alienated myself from all of them. I watched the news too much. I cared too much about the election, not enough about my own life. And so I couldn't really touch the book because the version of myself that was waking up every morning wasn't the version of myself that wrote that book. And so I was like, maybe I should delete the whole book. And I remember by the end of the year, so it was 2024, a year after all of that had happened, after all the success, it was the complete opposite. And we were sitting here in Mass, not in this church, but it was in San Jose. And I'll never forget this homily. The priest said something along the lines of, the only person that could possibly help you when you're down is Jesus. And if you think that you don't need his hand, he will push you down further. And I was like, well, you know, we should need to try this Jesus thing. And so I'm not going to say that I was a perfect Catholic from that day forward. I think we tend to over romanticize pivotal moments in our life. But I think one moment leads to an avalanche of other moments, which then leads to one pivotal moment where you finally reach the summit. And so it was a process of about another year, so 2025, of trying to rehabilitate myself. And it wasn't that successful. But I at least was able to look at the mirror and be prouder of the person I was, and certainly be more confident that the person I was could get to heaven. Because the version of me that finished the first draft, the version of me that went viral on Twitter, that version of me was never getting into heaven. That version of me was not someone that I would have recommended anybody look up to. I certainly don't look up to that version of myself. I think, like Matthew McConaughey said during his famous Oscar speech, I looked at myself in the mirror and thought, in 10 years, I could be proud of myself. And I think that should be the goal for every person. But certainly, I thought I was able to look at myself and at least think, you're good enough to finish this version. And I think the beautiful thing about it is my actions probably didn't meet the 34 chapters I wrote, but at least in my mind, I was like, I know that if I follow my own advice, because by that point it was linked directly to the church's teachings, I know that I could get myself better. And I really do want to get this message across to other people. And so I finished that. I finished the draft. I got it copyrighted about April or May of 2025, and then October 6th, I got it published. And it still took a couple other months. I would still say that it wasn't until probably a couple of days before we met that I was finally comfortable living that faith. And certainly I've stumbled a couple of times this summer, but I think that I am probably living more of my book than what I'm missing out on. So, yeah.
That was probably the best. I don't know how many minutes of an interview I've ever had. I'm like sitting here like I'm watching this interview right now, and I'm just like, wow,
No, 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 no.
amazing.
Yeah,
No, because what you're describing is something
yeah,
so real and so genuine,
mm,
and I think that yeah, something that really struck me was we tend to over romanticize pivotal
mm.
moments in our life. Wow. I mean, you talk about humility, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. You said San Jose. That's my parish, by the
That's
way.
yeah,
San Jose
yeah,
is my parish, so I probably know who the priest was that you're talking about. Um, I mean, wow,
yeah.
so amazing. What are some of the spiritual habits then you've
Mm.
added now as a Catholic? So daily mass, rosary, like what are some of the things you've incorporated?
I think the first thing I'll say is that the person sitting across from you is obviously a human being. So sometimes I have habits that I know will lead me to heaven, and I know that sometimes I have some habits that I got to get rid of because
Sure,
it's going to drag me down. I
sure.
think when I'm at my best, I think I pray the rosary every day, at least consistently. When I can, I try going to daily mass. I think that if you ask the people at St. John Paul II, certainly Jonathan the seminarian, who was previously at San Jose, he can tell you that I try to come here as much as possible. Playing the violin is great, but more than anything, I practice it almost every single day because I'm part of the choir. And so not only do I get to practice, but I get to thank God for the ability of having those talents. I see it as a way of paying him back for it. And so certainly as of recently, I've been practicing almost every single day. But I think more important than anything, the kinds of books that I've been reading is different than before because I've gotten away from sort of that Stoic philosophy that Jordan Peterson, not that that's harmful, by the way. I think that's a great start. I think certainly if it wasn't for Ryan Holiday, if it wasn't for Jordan Peterson or James Clear or Cal Newport, I don't think I'd be sitting across from you. But it's a starting point. It's not the end point. And so certainly Father Brandenburg with the Lumen Institute, he has some phenomenal books that I've been reading recently. Lessons from St. Joseph's Workshop is great. St. Joseph in particular is someone that I've gotten very close to recently, um, reading a lot about him. I also have this Catholic prayer book that has like a story of a saint from every day and some prayers. So certainly not every single day, but when I commit myself to God, I read that when I wake up and before I go to bed. And I think more than anything, though, I try to ask my mom what she needs help with. Obviously, some days I do a better job of this than others, but if she needs me to sweep the floors, I'll do it. If she needs me to do my laundry, I'll do it. And I think that part in particular is something that I haven't always been perfect in. I think probably I could have had a better relationship with her had I not thought that I knew everything. But a couple of days ago, because we were having a little back and forth, and I wasn't totally being perfect about the way that I was acting. I watched a scene from the Passion of the Christ. Uh, it's the one where Jesus is walking as he's carrying the cross, and he falls down, and then Mary's running to him, and then it cuts to when he fell down when he was a little kid, and she picked him up. And I was like, I don't know how many times I've fallen in my almost 18 years of being here, but I can't remember the last time that I picked her up when she was falling. And so I was like, I could probably do that. And that isn't to say that I do that every single day. There's probably some days when I'm not acting like a good kid. There's probably some days when I am, but I think as of recently, as of the last couple of weeks, I've been really trying to hit that in particular because you can read all the news you want. You can know the names of every single secretary in the cabinet. You can know the names of every congressman. You can have all the policy ideas. But what I really realized as of recently was that if you're not making sure that you're living your life with the people around you in the best way possible, none of that matters. And I think certainly that's made me a better person, but that's also made me realize who my actual support system is. Because the people that like the posts on Instagram or the people that congratulate you for what you do, they could be here one day and the next day they're not. But my mom is always going to be my mom, no matter how much I disappoint her.
Wow.
My dad's always going to be my dad, no matter how many times we fight. Even if I forget to text my sister for a couple of weeks, she'll respond back. Same thing with my grandma and my uncles and all that stuff. And so I think really trying to look inward to see where I can help first instead of looking outward is better. Because I used to wake up every day thinking to myself, how can I make sure that people see me as the smartest person in the room? And I think I'm not going to say I think about this every day, but certainly more days than not as of recently. I think to myself, how can I be a good member of my family? And so I think by having that thought in my head, it kind of fixes everything.
That is so
Yeah.
it's great evidence of conversion. The
Mm.
fruits we get connected to this idea of the Gospels. Jesus says, "You will be known by your fruits," and
Yeah.
we tend to think, I think, our fruits are associated with the success we have,
Mm.
when the false reality of that is like that's not what he's talking
Mm.
about. The fruits that Jesus is talking about is the fruits of love. It's the
Mm.
fruits of, compassion and mercy and service and humility.
Yeah.
Those are the fruits that we're
Mm.
known by. And you mentioned Saint Joseph. What a
Yeah.
great figure, because nothing's written about him in the scriptures other than
No.
some very little information,
Mm.
but yet with such little written about this man, we
Yeah.
can learn so much. And I think that's kind of one of the sweet lessons of
Mm.
building fortitude, the virtue of fortitude
Yeah.
is one, I struggle with this as of recently. One of the
Mm.
things I've struggled with. Another really Holy Spirit divine
Yeah.
appointment for you and I to be here is I started running. I've started
Yeah. Yeah.
running lately.
Yeah. I
I'm
can
not a
tell.
runner.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I feel
He
good.
gets skinnier every time I see him.
There we
It's
go.
great.
It's the black shirt.
So much. It's the
That's
45-minute jog. Yeah.
that's right. But I started running. And this is a silly analogy, but um, when I started running, obviously it's really hard,
Mm.
and so for me, it was just a matter of, okay, when I'm running, just try to run. Initially, it was just
Mm.
run for 5 minutes
Yeah.
and then walk,
Mm.
right? And you just start gradually increasing it over and over. And then you get to the point where you're building your endurance and you start to realize, okay, if I'm going to finish this run, I can't run too
Mm.
fast or I'll burn out.
Yeah.
Also, the rule of thumb is you want to look so many feet in front of
Mm.
you. So you're not looking so far on the horizon. You're
Yeah.
looking right, all of these things started to just be
Mm.
more than physical and endurance and physical strength. It became a lesson for everything in life, right?
Yeah.
And we get to the scriptures, and of course in the liturgy of our word and the cycle of our readings, while I'm going through this training period for running, the scriptures are all about life being a race, and like,
Yeah.
the apostle Paul talking about, like a cloud of witnesses,
Yeah.
run the race that's set before you,
Yeah.
persevere, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. It was in those moments where I started realizing, even opening up my Strava account after a run, I was seeing all my peers that are running with me, and I'm looking at their times and I'm looking at their distance, and
Yeah.
I'm thinking, oh, I can't let them run faster than me. I
Yeah.
can't let them run farther than me. In that training period, the Lord reminded me in this whole
Mm,
thing, like, where are you able to stop looking at everybody else around you on
mm,
this race as competitors, and where can you start looking at
mm.
all of these tools as encouragement? And
Yeah.
so, real quick story, I had been training for a 5K,
Right. Yeah.
and so I ran my first 5K last weekend, so Fourth of July weekend.
Whoa.
And it's so funny because I'm in this mindset of I'm gonna go out there and just run as fast as I can. I'm getting
Mm,
like a mile and a half in. I'm running at an incredible pace. I'm definitely gonna hit sub 30 in my 5K, and I felt really good. And I see this young boy
mm,
running, stopping,
mm.
running,
Stopping.
stopping, and I recognized him
Mm.
as a peer of my son's.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I called out his name, and he looks up at me, and he looked like somebody who had been pushed further down into the water, to
Mm.
your earlier
Yeah.
analogy. So I said, you know what? I looked down at my watch. I slowed down. I said, hey, man, stay with me.
Mm,
Let's slow down. Breathe in your nose, man.
mm,
Slow your breath down. And I started coaching him for the last mile and a half. And I see his family in the horizon standing on the
mm.
sidewalk, and he's not aware of his surroundings at this point.
Yeah.
And I'm like, all right, buddy, I see your family. Lift up your head. Put a smile on your face. Look over to the left and give them a smile, man.
Mm,
And we finished the race, and I didn't break my time. I
mm.
didn't I didn't do the records, but after the race, I realized this is what our faith journey is all about. Not being perfect. It's
Yep.
not about being fast. It's not about, the scriptures say it's what he equates our journey, our pilgrimage here on earth is like a marathon,
Mm,
like a runner who's run the race, not a sprint.
mm.
And those that are next to us are meant not to be people we compete with, but that we are supposed to lift up, that we're supposed to have them lift us up.
Yeah.
And it really dawned on me, like, even with all this running, it's so funny how just something like running
Yeah.
can really make so many more impact
Yeah.
and create so many lessons in your life. But the Lord is calling on us
Yeah.
to run this race,
Mm.
to set our eyes on Jesus,
Exactly.
the author, the perfecter of our faith. And we have this cloud of witnesses, like
Mm.
the saints that are in heaven, cheering us on.
Yeah.
Likewise, the Lord is calling on us to recognize those who are also running this race
Yeah.
at different paces, at different kind of variables. And to me, there's no greater lesson of fortitude
Yeah.
than recognizing in humility we're called not just to be
Yes.
great, but we're called to bring others with us to heaven.
And I think that really is what culminated my faith journey because I was talking about in May, and I was reminded of this when with your story. Um, I remember I had a confession with Father Lavia, and obviously he knew that I was coming into my faith more and more, and he started telling me, "Oh, when you start praying every day, that'll be the next step. When you start thinking about how to get to heaven, that'll be the next step." But he would always tell me, when you find a person who is struggling and your first instinct is to go and help them, that's when I know that you'll have fully come back to your faith. And so I was like, okay. And obviously, in writing the book, you're able to help a lot of people. But as I said before, what I most wanted to do, even in my most egotistical moment, was always to have that one on one conversation with someone. Because not only had I wished that I was able to have that conversation with someone when I was struggling, but I also think it's important. Like, even this, like, we could have had this over text, but the fact that we're in person makes it so much more personal and makes it better. And so I asked this person if I could share this story, and they said yes. So I'll go ahead and share it. I shared it with Chris and my dad, so they know about it. But it was about late May. It was after I became national debate champion. So I was really proud of myself, but I was really humble about it. And I remember the night that I won, I remember I prayed that God will help me find someone that was struggling the same way that I was. And I walk in the next day to my freshman year geometry class because the teacher and me were pretty close. And I see this young girl having a conversation with the geometry teacher. And I was like, maybe I shouldn't be here. And she said that she couldn't finish her AP World Test because she had a panic attack. And I was like, oh, shoot. Well, the bill's coming due like right now. And so at first, I walked out of the room and I was like, I don't want to do this because obviously, when a guy approaches a girl, that's very delicate and you don't want them to think that you're approaching them for, just to try to make a move or whatever. So I remember I was like, I don't know if I should do this because I'm really nervous. And I remember I didn't go to bed that night until 4 o'clock in the morning the next morning because I was like, well, I gotta make sure that she's in the room and I can tell her all this. And I was thinking about what I was gonna say, and I had it all down to a T. But I was like, oh, what if I forget? Or oh, no, I shouldn't do this. No, she's gonna think that it's like weird or whatever. And I was just, you know, what you should do. You should pray, and then you should see what happens. And after I prayed, I felt moved to just write a little letter of multiple pages. And so it was 4:30. I was like, I'm not gonna go to bed. So I pulled out a couple papers and I started writing it. And so I remember I went to school and I was like, I'm gonna find out if she's in the same room or not. And if not, then I'll just give it to her at the end of the day. And the entire time I was sitting, it was a Tuesday. The entire time that I was in school, it was the end of school year, so we didn't really have anything. I was like, oh, I was really nervous about it. I almost had another panic attack because I was like, I don't know if she's gonna take this the wrong way or not. But I wanted to make her feel like someone knew what she was going through. And I find her, and I found her right as I was about to leave, and I was like, all right, if you're gonna do this, you gotta do this now. So I went up to her, and my entire body was trembling. I was like, holy crap! I didn't even say anything. My hand was like an earthquake as I tapped her on the shoulder, and then I didn't even say anything. And I had the letter in my hand, and it was shaking, and then I just walked away, and I left my number there in case she wanted to talk, because I know that for me personally, like whether it's Chris or my dad or my middle school band teacher, like being able to have that contact is important. But that's also why I was nervous, because I didn't know if she was going to take it the wrong way. And Tuesday night came and she didn't text, and I was like, crap, I think that this went the wrong way. I was like, this went the wrong way. And then I get on Wednesday and I see her in the library. I was like, ah, whatever. No, I gotta leave because she probably thinks that I whatever. And then Thursday night, she texts me and she was like, at first it was an unknown number. I was like, it'd be really funny if it was her. And then she texted me and was like, oh shoot, it is her. And obviously I'm not going to reveal what we talked about, but she really felt like she was touched and she felt like it was God's way of reassuring her. And I don't bring that up because I'm proud of it. I bring it up because I really think that that's what running the race means. For you, that might have been looking at your son's friend and being able to tell him that he has to keep his head up. But ultimately, I think for me, that unlocked a part of my personality that I'd always been struggling with, because my mom can tell you that I can love very deeply, but I have a tough time expressing that to people. And when I was able to express my care to someone, even if I was scared that they were going to take it the wrong way, that really showed me what being a Catholic is all about. Obviously, we have a litany of saints who have a litany of teachings, but when you're able to selflessly help other people, even if you're scared to do so, I think that ultimately taught me something. When I was a Stoic, I wouldn't have been able to do that. When I was struggling, I would not have been able to do that. But I think when you're willing to realize that he's the guy that controls everything and you just got to do whatever he says, it makes it a lot easier to help people. And so I may have not, it wasn't certainly as brave as my mom taking me to therapy or my dad teaching me how to debate or my sister bringing me along with her friends when I didn't have any. But I felt like it was the first step of me really giving back to someone. And so I thank her for allowing me to share it, but also because I think I'm not going to say that I'm a saint or that I'm a perfect person, but I feel like today more than ever, I think I'm closer to God, which honestly is what this is all about. So,
Amen.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
so good, man. So I'd like to end the conversation with,
Yeah.
this idea of your hope for this generation,
Mm,
because that is a question
mm,
that so many of us are wrestling with. Is there hope for this generation? And so my question to you is your perspective first on why so many
mm,
members of Gen Z are rediscovering faith, purpose, and the Catholic Church. Do you think there's something to this? I mean, you just kind of alluded
mm,
to a little bit of that. What's your perspective on this generation
yeah.
coming back to the faith and the church?
Mm. Well, I don't think Gen Z is a Catholic generation yet. But the thing about my generation is we have an access to more information than we've ever had before. If you want to find information on anything, the history of Barcelona, Stoicism, how to make your life better, you can find that information online easier. It used to be that you would have to go to a library and pick out a book and then you'd have to read, but now more than ever, it's easy. So you have that curiosity and you have an avenue for that curiosity to be explored. But my generation is also very frustrated at the world that's been left behind. I think this resentment goes a little bit too far, but especially if you go online, a lot of members of my generation are frustrated at the way that the boomers behaved or the millennials behaved. Again, I think this goes way too far, but they want something that's deeper than that. And there is a sense in my generation that the answers to a lot of our questions are out there somewhere, but they don't know where. And so when you're trying to better yourself, you might stumble across Jordan Peterson or you might stumble across Ryan Holiday, but you start to realize that you need something more than self-improvement. And, you know, Father Mike Schmitz is out there, Bishop Barron is out there. And so people start realizing, oh, Father Mike Schmitz is right about this. So is Bishop Barron. I wonder what that St. Thomas Aquinas guy they're always talking about teaches. And so they go and you're able to access that. And so they become curious. And as curious people, we find a lot of answers unsatisfying because we've seen that the answers that the world has given us, or maybe previous generations have given us, haven't really been satisfying or produced a world that is either beautiful to look at or beautiful to live in.
Mm.
But when they look at Catholic answers, we're so satisfied. It makes sense. And not only because it makes logical sense, but when we then get the confidence to go to a physical church, what do you find? Let's say, and I've seen multiple friends go through this. I have one friend in particular who used to be an atheist, and now she goes to church every day here at St. John Paul II. What does she find if she walks through St. John Paul II? So she's curious. She sees that the church offers satisfying answers. And then when she goes to church, she sees a loving community. She sees that Father Lavia talks about humility every day on the pulpit. And then before she leaves, there he is to shake her hand. She sees that Father Lavia talks a lot on the pulpit about opening up your space to those in need. And then what does she see? She sees that he offers you and I a space to talk in the church when maybe he would want to go home on a Saturday. And then what else does she see? If she wants to play in the choir, you have a bunch of people in the choir that are willing to help her out. If she wants to get involved, the world says you're too young for that, but she finds you who gives a platform to people, Chris Angle who also gives a platform to people, the bishop opening up his time on a Friday no less to talk to a group of people that want answers. But more than anything, the church offers something so attractive that a lot of members of my generation can't articulate, but whenever many of my friends my age convert to Catholicism, what they always tell me is the Catholic Church talks the talk, but they also walk the walk. And in the Bible, it says, by the fruits you shall know them. And certainly by the fruits of the church, we know that it's divinely inspired. Of course it is. Otherwise, we still wouldn't be here. And so, in a world that offers unsatisfying answers, and in a world that is not so beautiful, when they come to the Catholic Church, they find an institution that offers satisfying answer after satisfying answer, but they also find a loving community of people with beautiful buildings to bout. So when you combine all of that together, I think a lot more people are. I think that come 50 years' time, I would not be surprised if 70% of us are Catholic. I think that's really where this is going.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
great that one I hope goes viral. I hope that clip right there. Maybe Father Mike will retweet it on
That's it.
that one. So, um, what a wonderful time talking
Yeah.
with you, Rodrigo. I suspect that anybody watching or
Mm.
listening to this episode is probably ready to pick a copy of your book up, whether it's English or Spanish.
Yeah.
So Fortitude is your
Yeah.
book.
The best way to find that is if you look up Rodrigo DeLeon Ruiz, DeLeon Ruiz on Amazon, it'll pop up and then you can get it on Amazon. Or you could follow the Instagram page at Rodrigo DeLeon Ruiz, and I post like twice a week, so I always put the link down there too.
Wonderful, and I'll make
Yeah.
sure to put the
Yeah.
information
Yeah.
in the show notes for this
Yeah.
episode. But I am just like totally inspired by your story. I am confident that so many people are going to benefit from your witness, and really, it is all glory be to God
Yeah.
because
Yeah. Yeah.
He is the ultimate kind of author and perfecter of your
Yeah.
faith, and so I'm just really elated to be sitting here today.
I'm
And
happy that you opened up your podcast. Yeah.
oh,
It's
thank
great. It's
you.
a good
Yeah.
podcast. Yeah.
You know, there's many times where I've thought, I'm just gonna
Ah,
shut
you
this
gotta
thing
keep
down.
going.
You know?
This is better than 60 minutes. This is really good.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Coming from you, it means a lot. I
Coming
mean,
from
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, well, ordinary time, that's what this is all about, man.
Yeah.
Ordinary time, the sole heart and purpose
Yeah.
was I I've said it so many times, but there are just so many people in these pews
Yeah.
that have such extraordinary stories and they're just such quiet, humble
Yeah.
servants of the Lord. And I thought, I didn't want to I didn't want to be just another podcast
Yeah.
guy
Yeah.
who interviews all the famous people out
No,
there.
no, no.
I wanted to interview the lay, ordinary people that are doing
Yeah.
extraordinary things for the kingdom.
Yeah.
And you have
No, no,
definitely
we
been,
still got a ways to go.
but you are on the track, man.
Yeah.
Rodrigo, thank you so
Thank you
much
so
for
much.
this day. I really enjoyed
Appreciate
our
it. It was a
conversation.
lot of fun. Make sure to
Absolutely.
follow the podcast.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you all so much for listening to another episode of Ordinary Time. I hope you were blessed by this
Yeah,
conversation, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
yeah.
Until then, God bless.
God bless.